having for fixed income. So, as an investor in these bonds, let's say we talk about Amazon, and if you compare it to the government rates, so let's say we make the yield curve, and this is the government bond rate yield curve. And for your corporate bonds, the returns are a little bit higher. And the reason for that is that, of course, they're not the government, right? Amazon might be a very good company, but it's not the US government. So that's why you're taking a little bit more risk, and therefore you're getting that little bit extra return. Now, why is this so important to understand? Is because let's say that return, we're talking about, let's say, a 10-year Amazon bond versus a 10-year government bond, and the return for the government bond, let's say, is 5%, and the return on the 10-year bond from Amazon is, let's say, 6%. You're getting that 1% extra. Now, first of all, why is the government giving you 5%? Right? What is the risk-free rate? Let's break it down. Let's say instead of going for a vacation with your family right now, you say we'll go after 10 years, right? And you save that money for 10 years. So the government should pay you a real risk-free rate, a real return, which we call the real interest rate, right, for postponing your consumption. That you could go for that vacation now, but you're not going now. You're saying we'll go after 10 years, right? So if you're postponing your consumption, you should get something in return. And let's say 10 years later, that vacation is going to cost a lot more because of inflation. So naturally, the government needs to pay you a component for inflation as well. And this links back to our quantitative methods discussion that the nominal risk-free rate is equal to the real interest rate and the inflation component. So that is your government bond return, right? That's where your government bond return is coming from. And inflation goes up and down, right? The real risk-free rate can go up and down depending on the monetary policy of the government. So this part of what you're earning when you're investing in the Amazon bond, as far as the 5% part is concerned, this is subject to macroeconomic changes or macro factors. So as an investor, you should know that the 5%, total you're earning 6%, but 5% of that is subject to macroeconomic factors which impact real interest-free rate and inflation. And then the spread that you're earning on top of that, so that additional 1% that you're earning, right? This is impacted by the situation of the economy. So, like in terms of credit risk, that what is the probability that Amazon might go bankrupt? So if that probability goes higher, then obviously the spread should be higher. If that probability goes lower, that spread should be lower. And similar other things which are related to the company, right? So these are company specific factors which obviously impact the spread. So the spread is impacted by company specific factors, whereas the risk-free rate is impacted by macro factors. Now, I'm calling it the risk-free rate because obviously it's the government bond rate that we are taking. But very often what happens is that when we are making this type of a comparison, the benchmark that we use, right, is not the government rate. Sometimes we use the interbank rate which the banks are lending to each other at, right? And this spread is, in the case of the government spread, it's called the G spread. But in the case of your, when you make it with the interbank rate as the benchmark, it's called the I spread. Now, why would you want to do it based on the interbank rate instead of the government rate? The reason is the government doesn't have securities for each maturity, right? They don't have securities for each maturity. So what if, let's say, you're issuing a 12-year bond, right? Or you're buying a 12-year Amazon bond and you need to calculate the spread on that, but there's no 12-year government bond. So how are you going to compare those two? And well, you can still do it, but then you have to estimate that 12-year bond yield through a process of linear interpolation, which is something we looked at in the previous learning module, and we look at it again here through the matrix pricing, where we will try to estimate the yield of a government bond for which the maturity doesn't exist. And that's one way of calculating the spread. But another way of doing it is that you could just work with the interbank fixed rates where banks are willing to give each other loans, and that you can find for almost all maturities, right? It's a very, very liquid market for, it's called swaps. And you'll learn more about it in derivatives. But the fixed rate component of swaps, at which banks are willing to lend to each other, is there for a lot of different maturities. So you can very easily put together that yield curve and then calculate the I spread. And the interbank rate is also affected by the macro factors. But then, of course, within that, there is a difference between the government rate and the interbank rate, because of course banks are again not the government. They might be safer than your corporates, but they are still not the government, because, well, government can print money, the banks cannot. So this is the high level concept over here, and let's get into it and fill color into this entire big picture that I just drew for you. So first of all, what is spread? Spread is the difference between what the bond is paying versus a certain benchmark. That benchmark could be government, it could also be interbank, right? So let's say we're talking about interbank, LIBOR, London Interbank Offer Rate. For a 3-year maturity, that's 5%, whereas your 3-year maturity bond is paying 7%. So clearly the spread is going to be 2% over here, right? The benchmark reflects macroeconomic factors, whereas your spread reflects the company or specific or issuer specific factors. There's a very nice infographic over here that you take the benchmark, whether that's the government rate or the interbank rate, right? And I would say government, because interbank, obviously there is some more components to it. But with the government, it's purely your real rate and your expected inflation. But if the benchmark is your interbank rate, then there is definitely a component of some other macro factors, such as overall, risk of recession and bankruptcy, which brings in that component of default risk, which is there in banks, which is not there in the government. But let's say if the benchmark is the government rate, then you've got the risk-free, because government bonds, the T-bills and the T-bonds and the T-notes are risk-free. And it has 2 of these components. And then you have your spread, which is related to number 1 and most importantly, credit risk, right? So this is the big one, that the company goes bankrupt and they're not able to pay you. Of course, liquidity, because it's not going to be as liquid as government bonds. So the ability to buy and sell, and more importantly, sell when you want and not lose a lot of money on it. And of course, taxation. So all these issuer specific factors will determine the spread on top of your benchmark. And when you're buying a bond, right, obviously you realize by now that the price of a bond is very sensitive to changes in yield to maturity. But what is that yield to maturity? It has 2 components, as we just talked about. There is that benchmark, right, component, and then there is the spread. Let me go back and emphasize on this again. The yield to maturity, my friends, has two components. One which is sensitive to macroeconomic factors, and the other one which is sensitive to issuer specific factors. So when we now look at our bond price, we understand that yes, it is sensitive to changes in yield, but the yield itself has two components. One is the benchmark and the other one is the spread. So what I really want to know as an investor in this bond is that, hey, how much of my bond price is sensitive to changes in macro factors, right, which obviously would create changes in the benchmark rates, and how much of my bonds price is actually sensitive to changes in company specific factors. So because of my spread is going up or down, and that is why my bond price can go down or up. So this is a very, very important point actually. And as you go through your CFA level 1 and then level 2 and then level 3, you understand more and more that what is the importance of your price sensitivity, which will measure something through something called duration. And there are a lot of different duration measures. And so we'll get into that when you get to that part of your to that learning module. But here the concept that you need to absorb is that the price of the bond, as you have studied, is related to the changes in YTM, right? Inversely related. There's an inverse relationship here. As the YTM goes up, the price comes down. As the YTM comes down, the price goes up. And yes, that relationship is convex. But within the YTM, there are two components. And we need to understand how sensitive is our price to the changes in benchmark versus the changes in spread. So you know where your sensitivity is coming from. And of course, that spread could be G spread or I spread, depending if you're using the government bond rates as the benchmark, or you're using your swap rate, which is again your interbank fixed rate of the swaps. And you'll learn more about swaps and derivatives. So that, of course, is the case. And as I told you, the issue with government bonds is that they're not there for all maturities. And swaps are there for all maturities. So that's why I spread is relatively easier to calculate. For G spread, if there is a bond that doesn't exist, you have to use linear interpolation. And let me just remind you what was linear interpolation. So let's say you have a government bond for 10 years, you have a government bond for 20 years, but you don't have a government bond for 12, right? So how will you estimate the 12-year return? So first of all, let's say you know the yield for the 20-year, and let's say that is 7%. You know the yield for 10-year, let's say that is 5%, right? And you want to find out what will be the yield for 12. So the way we do that, and we did this in the previous learning module, you'll take that difference between 7 and 5, and you'll take this difference, sorry, not 7 and 5, between 20 and 10, because this is 20 years and 10 years, right? And you'll take this difference between 10 and 12. So that's going to be 12 minus 10. So what you're basically doing over here is you want to know, okay, how much is 12 far from 10 versus how much is 20 far from 10, right? And then you will multiply this with the difference in 7 and 5% to get this component over here, right? And then whatever that component is, actually let me calculate it for you. So 12 minus 10 is 2 divided by 20 minus 10, which is 10, multiplied by 7 minus 5, and that comes to 0.4. So this component over here is 0.4. Now I'll add that to 5 to get this point over here. So obviously 5 plus 0.4 is 5.4, and that is going to be my 12-year government interpolated rate, right? And then I can use that to add my spread on top of that to calculate, okay, how much my corporate will be paying for that much. right? Or whether if I already know the corporate rate, then I can work backwards and calculate the spread. So very nice infographic here showing us what is going on. So again, we are interested in the 12-year, right? So what we are doing, we're taking that 20-year rate and we're taking that 10-year rate, and we want to find out that a difference between these two. So that is the linear interpolation, and whatever that rate is, we'll take out the difference between your corporate rate and the government rate, and it will tell you the G spread. Now, just to make sure you understand the concept, let me take you through an example. So we've got a government bond which is 3-year. We've got a corporate bond which is also 3-year, right? The corporate bond is paying a 5% coupon, whereas the government bond is paying the 3% coupon. Now you can't directly do 5 minus 3 is equal to 2 and say the 2 is the spread. You have to actually calculate the yield to maturity for each of them. So because the present value is not 100, right? The present value is a little bit different. So you take those two present values into account and you calculate the yield to maturity for the corporate, and you calculate the yield to maturity for the government, and then you calculate the difference between those two and you get your spread. If you didn't know the government bond yield, that's where the linear interpolation comes in. Now this is something I want you to calculate, right? I'll just help you out a little bit. You've got a government bond for 7 and you've got a government bond for 10 years, right? And so let's say this is your yield curve. So 7 is giving 1.39 and 10 is giving 1.66. Now what you need to find out is this G spread for the bank bond, and bank bond is obviously 8 years, right? So first of all, find out what is the government bond yield for 8 years. And then the rest is going to be easy. You just have to subtract that from the corporate or the bank bond in this case. But the real question is that how will you calculate the yield for the 8-year government bond? So please pause the video, try to do it. Okay, so hopefully you were able to get it. Before I show you the solution, I want to calculate it with you. So first of all, what's the difference between 7 and 10? And what's the difference between 7 and 8, right? That's what we are interested in. So 8 minus 7 divided by 10 minus 7. And that distance we're going to multiply with this, which is 1.66 minus 1.39. So that will give us that little bit extra that 1 year portion is going to be. So 8 minus 7 is 1 and 10 minus 7 is 3. So 1 divided by 3 multiplied by 1.66 minus 1.39, and that comes to 0.09. So this extra portion is 0.09, and if I just add it to 1.39, 1.39 plus 0.09, so for the 8 year I actually get 1.48. And if my 8-year government is 1.48 and this bank is paying 2.68, so all I have to do is 2.68 minus 1.48 and I get a spread of 1.2. So this is my G spread. And there you have it. So the linear interpolation formula, 8 minus 7 divided by 10 minus 7 multiplied with 1.66 minus 1.39 gives you 0.09. Add that to the 1.39, you get 1.48, and subtract that from your corporate bond or bank bond in this case, and you get your G spread. Now, guys, these spreads, they are using this word Z, right? Which is obviously not, it's not G, it's not I. So again, I mean, Z spread can be G, it can be I. It really depends on what the benchmark is, right? So if your benchmark is the government, then obviously your Z spread will be called the G spread, right? If it's the interbank rate, it will be the I spread. But we are calling it the Z spread here because the main point being stated over here is that the spread stays the same across all maturities, right? So that's what it's saying, that it it is the static spread. It's constant for all periods, it doesn't change. So that's the main concept over here. Number one. Number two, you can use the Z spread to calculate something called an option adjusted spread. Now just hold on a minute and please think with me that what did we say about callable bonds? If Amazon has the right to call it back, then you as an investor are not very happy and you will want either a lower price on this, which means you want a higher yield on this, right? So the Z spread will be higher for callable because you as the investor would want a higher return, so you would want a higher spread over and above the benchmark, right? And Z spread would be lower for puttable bonds because if it's puttable, you have the right as the investor to put it back and take your money back before maturity. So then obviously your return will be less. You will have to pay a higher price for that type of a premium bond. So now if let's say my callable spread is higher because as an investor I'm taking more risk, so I will have to minus from that spread, and this is by the way in basis points, which means it's 0.9%, right? I'll have to minus from it something to get to an option adjusted spread to bring it lower. And if, for example, if it is a puttable bond, then I'm already having a lower spread, right? I'm earning less because I have this ability of putting it back whenever I want. If you want an option adjusted spread, if you want to take out the value of that option, that put option, then you have to add it to bring it to the option adjusted value. So that is the point here. And that is it for this learning module. We talked about your stated rate, also called APR, annual percentage rate. We talked about your effective annual rate, and we learned how to play around with these rates where APR, whatever is your compounding frequency, divided by that compounding frequency to the power of that compounding frequency, can be equated to another APR of a different compounding frequency, and you can just have to divide it by that and put it to the power of, and that is putting them at the same effective annual rates and calculating the different stated rates. We looked at the different conventions. Street convention is 3360. True yield is based on actual. Government is also based on actual, but they are semi-annual. Current yield is very simple. You just have to take the coupon amount for the whole year divided by the current price, the flat price, and you've got your yield to call, and then yield to worst, yield to first call, second call, and we talked about all of that. And then of course our G spread, our I spread, and our Z spread, which are constant throughout the maturity, and you just add or subtract from them depending whether it is a callable bond or a puttable bond. And callable bond, obviously you're earning extra spread because you're taking more risk, so you'll have to subtract from it to get to the option adjusted spread. And for a puttable, so for a callable you have to minus, and for a puttable you're already getting less because you are buying a bond which is having that premium option, so you'll have to add to it to get to the option adjusted spread. So that is it, my friends, for this learning module. Hope you enjoyed it. Of course, you can watch the video again if you need further clarification. Don't forget to solve a lot of questions, And best of luck, and hope to see you in the next video.